No, you can't. No, you can't. Do the thing. Do the thing. No, you can't do the thing. No, you can't do the thing. No, 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 no. You can't do the thing. No, 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 no. Hell no, baby. No, you can't do the thing.
No, Ubisoft, you can't do the thing. You're looking at right here a change.org petition in Japanese. We'll get it translated to Google for Google Translate here in just a second, but I wanted to point out that this is a real, at least in Japanese, change.org petition. And from what I can tell, this is from a real person. So this isn't one of those Akira Yamato made up things there, you know. But let's see what this has to say here. All right, let's translate this to English. All right, so it says Assassin's Creed Shadows to be canceled. All right, so that's what this says here. Now, you'll note that almost 30,000 people have signed this petition. All right, now this is from around the world. When we scroll down here, we're going to see some weebs that show up here with their own concerns about what's happening here, their own support of the petition. But let's go ahead and scroll down on this, right? Just like that guy speeding by real fast, we're going to speed down here to why this petition matters, all right? Recently, the lack of historical accuracy and cultural respect has been a serious issue regarding the upcoming game, Assassin's Creed Shadows, by game developer Ubisoft. The game is based on Japanese samurai and ignores the fact that samurai were a higher class of warrior class and should have been given gokunin, or servants of servants of nobles. It should have been gokunin, or servants of nobles. In fact, the first European to hold the title of samurai, William Adams, served Tokugawa Ieyasu as a 250 koku hatamoto. I'm not sure what that is. Please let me know down in the comments what a koku hatamoto is. I'm not sure. In this history, Ubisoft continues to misunderstand the nature and role of samurai. This is a serious insult to Japanese culture and history and may also be linked to Asian racism. Remember, these are the same. Ubisoft told us that they needed non-Japanese eyes to tell this story, but didn't need non-Egyptian eyes and non-Italian eyes and non-Jerusalem eyes. I'm not sure, but they didn't need people from outside to help things. And even then, as I was told in the comments about Black Flag is not about the main character saving the Caribbean. He's combating the Templar, who are like basically the terror of the sea. So very, very different attitude toward Assassin's Creed Shadows, particularly because the Japanese are homogeneous, meaning they don't have a lot of diversity on the islands of Japan. And, you know, believe it or not, it seems to be working out okay for them. Their birth rates are low, but their media has to do with that. And this is why fighting to keep Japanese media is important, as we see right here. We call on Ubisoft to immediately cancel the release of Assassin's Creed Shadows and show sincere research and respect for Japanese history and culture. We need your signature. Sign this petition to let Ubisoft know the importance of cultural respect and historical accuracy. Now, again, I want to remind everybody why this is a problem, okay? In Japan, Yasuke isn't even in their historical textbooks. He's like one of those, remember that one-time stories? He's a bit like a Wyatt Earp and well, not like Wyatt Earp because he's more of a myth. I'm thinking of Billy the Kid. That's right. Billy the Kid and like Jesse James. These outlaws are people that in America, we remember them as outlaws. Yasuke wasn't an outlaw, but these people don't have an official place in history. They're not integral to the flow or changes in our culture, and they're not integral to what happened that shaped the era in which they lived. They are simply important people to the regions they were active in. And in reality, Yasuke is only really important to history because he was important to Nobunaga. We heard mention of him before in this write-up. Now, I'm not familiar with a lot of Japanese terminology. I only know the English stuff that came through. Again, I'm not a turbo weeb. I don't go in and learn the Japanese language through and through. I try to pronounce things correctly because I don't want to mispronounce them and give someone the idea that something is another thing. But other than that, I'm not really that well versed in this stuff. But what I've read and what I understand about samurai culture is that you cannot become a samurai in 15 months. And this is the amount of time that Yasuke spent with Nobunaga as his sword bearer. And again, this is perfectly amount of time that you would need to be a sword bearer. You know, that's perfectly fine. You're dressed up in armor. You might know how to parry, maybe, but mostly what you do is you present the ceremonial sword to your daimyo, the lord of the land, and which was Nobunaga, and you present the sword to him when he has to kill or perform ceremony. That's it. The rest of the time, you're a very important person to that region because the regional lord has you carrying his sword. All right? That's not intended to rhyme, but there you go. If you're a Game Grumps fan, it's Lord Gord has a nice sword, right? Yasuke carries Lord Gord's sword. Anyway, back to this. So Assassin's Creed Shadows strikes a very awkward note with anybody who's familiar with Japanese history to begin with and may have had a previous knowledge of Yasuke outside of the really hyper-warped history that most media presents about him. Again, he's not interesting to Westerners who want to tell a story about an African man living in Japan. They find him very boring in that he was a noble as far as like carrying around the sword of the Lord goes, right? That's a nobleman as far as that's concerned. But he was still a servant of Nobunaga. Nobunaga tried to wash the black off of him several times. Japan at this time had no concept of a place like Africa. They hadn't spread out. They'd been very isolationist, just like the Chinese before them. So this whole situation of Yasuke being important to Nobunaga for anything other than his height and just how scary it was to see somebody who looked like that. You have to remember, the Japanese had never encountered people like this before. The darkest complexion on their island are what we see now. These people of the Southern Islands, I believe, they're a little closer to Filipino in their complexion, a little closer to South Vietnamese in their complexion. So that's it. That's it. The Japanese had no concept of this. The Russians were the only white people that they had ever encountered, and even then, that was sparse. In came the Dutch from Europe, and ta-da, they bring these African people, or in particular, this one African man that caught the attention of Nobunaga. So this is not something that's like normal in Japanese history. A legendary black samurai never existed, ever. A slave who was given a very prominent and honorable role existed. And this is why people in Japan have a problem with Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, the reason why this took so long, right? You might be asking yourself, well, if they know all of this and they don't like it, what took them so long? The thing you have to learn about the Japanese is that they're very much see it and believe it, okay? They're not, they don't take like someone's opinion and run with that as fact. It's not, again, this isn't like 100% every Japanese person in the country, but their culture is very fact-based, very logic-based, very results-oriented. So if this thing does this, that means that this opinion I heard earlier is correct. But until that point, it was just an opinion, just like the air moving along through my day, okay? Now that they've seen gameplay footage, now that they've had Ubisoft come out and make all of these insane declarations about who Yasuke is to their history, now these petitions start to surface. Now the Japanese start to become more vocal because there's no denying the intention behind making Yasuke the primary male protagonist in the story. Now, there's rumor, and I don't think this is true, but there is rumor going around that they're going to add a white protagonist to this. This is, again, another problem, right? And again, it's unconfirmed. I'm not saying this is actually happening, but it's floating around on the internet. The reason why I didn't bring it up on screen is because I just don't want it to glow and blow up if it's nothing real, okay? I don't want that. We can wait and find out if it's confirmed or not, but let's say it's a rumor for the moment, take it as a rumor, and say this about that rumor. It's a bad idea, okay? A lot of the people who are proponents of Yasuke point to the movie Last Samurai, and they complain that people didn't lose their minds over a white guy being a samurai in that. And he isn't, though. He is not a samurai. He is barely trained in how to use the sword. Most of what you see Tom Cruise's character, most of what you see Tom Cruise's character go through in that movie, right? Most of that is him becoming more attuned with the spiritual nature of the Japanese, learning the Bushido code and understanding their plight against their own nation, their own countrymen who have decided to embrace the Western modern model and abandon what the samurai in that story believe are the cultural roots of Japan, i.e. their necessity as a military force. Okay? It's not about that guy. The Last Samurai is about the story of the Last Samurai, not Tom Cruise's character. He isn't the Last Samurai. He's the one who survives to tell the story about the Last Samurai. I can't stress this enough to people, that it's not an either or choice. It's like, oh, you have a black guy, you have a white guy. No. How about a Japanese guy? It's their history. We didn't do this to the Egyptians. We didn't do this to any other people in the background. And again, I'll stress this, right? In the backstories of the other installments, right? But I'll stress this about Caribbean. Again, he's not there to save the Caribbean. He's there fighting the Templar on the seas. I'm sorry. I get that this is a cool idea to people out there that want to stake a claim in Japanese culture. But Yasuke isn't even a character that they tell in history class. They talk about in history class. They don't tell the story of him unless you take a very special interest in the Sengoku era and start to study up on Nobunaga in a more serious manner. Like, this would be like telling you that George Washington's handmaiden was very important to the revolution, was very important to fighting for George Washington, to fighting the revolution, to pushing back against the British. It wouldn't have been able to be as successful, and this person was celebrated for their warrior prowess and received special uniforms for it and stood out in public and wore full military regalia in a peaceful situation on an average day. Okay? And that's why it's ridiculous, right? It's very ridiculous to go around and saying that this person who had a very honorable position for the time and his ethnic background, that's unheard of, right? I have to remind people of this constantly. Nobunaga's own blooded relatives, his own blood, didn't get this honor. Yasuke did. And that's not good enough for Ubisoft. That's not good enough for the white guys and white gals that made this story. The 98% white dev team aren't impressed enough that Nobunaga was worldly enough at that time to appreciate the threat that Yasuke would impose on his enemies when they witnessed a guy who was 5'10" in a land where the average male height is 5'3". All right, you have to remember that Yasuke was a giant compared to the average Japanese male at the time. And I'm not picking on the Japanese for being short. What I'm trying to illustrate is that this is what happened in history. Nobunaga saw a guy that they couldn't even get the armor on him. They had to make special armor for him because he was just that much bigger than the average Japanese soldier. At one point, they pounded out breastplate to make it big enough to go across him. It is one of those things where you have to ask yourself, like, why is this not interesting enough to a game development company that deals with a character that becomes an outsider in his own culture? Would not a character like Yasuke, who is an outsider, either by his own volition, well, obviously against his own volition, he was brought there as a slave. However, would that not be a good dynamic to have, that you have an ally inside of Nobunaga's palace who is Yasuke? I don't know about you, but that seems to make a bit more sense than granting him full military regalia and people bowing to him in the streets. They'd never seen someone who looked like him before. There would be people who would just be in shock of how tall he is, let alone you throw all the armor on him with the big pointy horns and all that jazz, give him a sword and a big old club on his back. He looks like he walked out of one of their myths, like an Oni from the woods to wreak terrible havoc. You have to understand they'd never seen anybody like this before. That's not racism when you encounter somebody who's just completely counter. Like, you got to remember, this is like going into Photoshop and hitting invert on everybody the Japanese have ever seen before in their existence. This isn't like something that was common, that African people were traveling through Japan on the regular. Not at all. So much so that regional lords like daimyo, like the daimyo Nobunaga, were not were not even aware that this was a skin color. They just thought he was dirty. You have to understand, like, this is why the Japanese are upset about this. This is why people around the world really are annoyed with this whole process, is because for whatever reason, Japan doesn't get to have their own protagonist. For years, people have been asking for a Japanese-based Assassin's Creed, and this has to be the least Japanese of the Assassin's Creed they could have put out. Yasuke's own battle music has a snare drum remix in it, all right? It's got a drum machine. What is that? Do you remember all the Italo disco that was in Assassin's Creed 2? Do you remember all the hard bass rave music that was in Assassin's Creed Odyssey? Don't you remember all that? No, you don't, because that would be silly to put that in the background of any battle hymn going on with the main character. Yet we do it with Yasuke, a man, by the way, who never set foot in the United States and was born, lived, and died 200 years before the country was ever established as independent from the British Empire, okay? So this guy has no roots in American hip-hop culture, but here we are. When I was growing up, that was racist, by the way. If you just slapped hip-hop music behind any old black guy at any old point in history, that was racism. You were assuming that every black person in history has some type of relationship with hip-hop music, despite it pretty much exclusively belonging to America. Thanks, CIA. Appreciate it. But again, we're taking a look at this right here with what the mistakes that Ubisoft has made and continue to make. They doubled down on this. Okay, they're not going to change it. And Japan is already showing us that this isn't going to fly. Now, with the current atmosphere going on, right, you heard about Helldivers losing 60% of their user base in the last month, okay? Remember that as this comes out, that there may be a big rush on it to be like, wow, we got to find out how it is. Within 6 months, you probably won't hear too much about Assassin's Creed Shadows whatsoever. And the reality is that you're probably looking at the greater tragedy in the game being is that it's boring. It'll most likely be a very lecture-driven, got to tell you all about the horrible things that were going on at the time to minority people or people that were outside of the culture. And that'll be mainly what it focuses on, is probably that, you know. And then, of course, they have to besmirch Nobunaga and they have to besmirch other Japanese historical figures for the sake of making sure that everything looks like it belongs, being stabbed to death by an African slave in Japan. Yeah. Well, anyway, until the next video, guys, good luck out there.